Have you ever noticed how it happens right at the edge? Not when things are calm, not when you feel prepared, but when you're about to fall apart. You're exhausted, overwhelmed, quietly asking how much longer you can hold everything together. And then something interrupts the collapse, a sentence you weren't looking for, a conversation that lands too precisely, a moment that feels out of place, yet impossible to ignore. At first you call it coincidence, you move on, but later it lingers. Why did it arrive exactly then? Why not earlier or later? And why did it affect you so deeply? What if that interruption wasn't random at all? What if reality itself responds when you reach a certain threshold, not to save you, but to speak to you? Not with noise, but with timing. And what if the real question isn't whether these moments mean something, but whether you've been listening when they happen? Most people move through their days assuming that reality is neutral. That things simply happen randomly without dialogue. A traffic jam is just bad luck. A sudden delay is an inconvenience. An uncomfortable feeling is brushed aside as stress. But if you slow down enough to observe, a different pattern begins to reveal itself. Reality is not silent. It is constantly answering you. The problem is not the absence of messages, it's the absence of listening. You wake up late on the day you were supposed to rush into a decision. A meeting gets cancelled at the last minute. You feel a subtle resistance in your body when you're about to say yes to something that looks perfect on paper. These are not dramatic signs, not voices from the sky. They're quiet adjustments, course corrections, and because they don't match the dramatic image people expect from guidance, they're ignored. Listening to reality doesn't mean becoming mystical or superstitious. It means developing sensitivity to feedback. Every action you take generates a response. Every internal state you maintain creates an external echo. When you're misaligned, reality tends to introduce friction. When you're aligned, things don't become perfect, but they become clearer. There's less internal conflict, less force, less noise. The issue is that most people only listen when reality is screaming, when something breaks, when a loss occurs, when exhaustion becomes unavoidable. But long before that, reality was already whispering. A pattern repeating. A door that never quite opens no matter how much effort you apply. A strange fatigue that appears only around certain people or goals. These are responses, but they require a different kind of attention than most people are trained to give. Modern life conditions you to override subtle signals. You're taught to push through discomfort, to ignore intuition, to value speed over perception. If something doesn't work, you assume the solution is more effort, more pressure, more control. But reality doesn't always respond to force. Often it responds to coherence. When your thoughts, emotions, and actions are misaligned, reality reflects that fragmentation back to you as confusion, delay, or resistance. Few people know how to listen because listening requires stillness, not external silence, but internal quiet. The kind that allows you to notice what changes when you stop trying to control outcomes. The moment you pause, something becomes visible that wasn't before. A detail, a feeling, a realization that had been drowned out by urgency. Reality uses these small openings to communicate. You might notice that certain problems persist no matter how much you think about them, and then, unexpectedly, the solution appears when you're not actively searching. Not because you gave up, but because your mind finally stopped interfering. That's not coincidence, that's responsiveness. Reality answers clarity with clarity. There's also a pattern in what you tend to miss. You notice dramatic opportunities, but overlook quiet warnings. You chase exciting possibilities while dismissing subtle discomfort. Over time, reality escalates. What began as a mild sense of unease becomes frustration, then obstruction, then crisis. Not as punishment, but as amplification. When you don't listen to whispers, you eventually hear echoes. Listening means asking a different question. Not, how do I get what I want? But, what is this situation reflecting about my current state? A delay might be asking for patience. A conflict might be exposing a boundary you've avoided setting. A repeated disappointment might be pointing to an expectation that no longer fits who you are becoming. Reality doesn't respond to your words. It responds to your orientation, to what you tolerate, to what you repeatedly choose despite discomfort, to what you avoid despite clarity. And because these responses are subtle, they're easy to misinterpret as bad luck or random chaos. The more reactive you are, the harder it is to listen. Anxiety compresses perception. Urgency narrows your field of awareness. When everything feels like an emergency, all signals blur together. That's why people often miss guidance precisely when they want it most. They're listening through noise, but once you begin to notice that reality is constantly adjusting around you, nudging, resisting, opening, closing, a new responsibility emerges. You can no longer claim ignorance. You start to see that many unexpected events were actually conversations you weren't participating in consciously. And this is where something shifts. Because if reality is responding, then the question isn't whether messages are being sent. The question becomes what happens when the mind grows quiet enough to finally hear them. There's a moment most people rarely notice because it's subtle and easily interrupted. It happens not when you're thinking harder, not when you're analyzing every option, but when the internal pressure eases just enough for something else to surface. The mind relaxes its grip. The constant commentary softens. And in that space, something becomes obvious. Not dramatic, not overwhelming, just clear. This is often misunderstood. People imagine that answers appear as sudden revelations, like lightning strikes of insight. But more often, the answer arrives as simplicity. A sense of this, not that. A quiet knowing that doesn't need justification. It doesn't shout. It doesn't argue. It simply stands there, waiting to be noticed. The difficulty is that most minds are never quiet long enough for this to happen. Even when the body stops moving, the mind keeps racing, replaying conversations, predicting outcomes, revising the past, planning the future. And in all that noise, the signal gets buried. Not because it isn't there, but because it can't compete with urgency. Have you noticed how solutions tend to show up when you're showering, walking, or doing something repetitive and simple? Moments when you're not actively trying to solve anything. The mind loosens, and suddenly a connection forms. This isn't accidental. It's a function of how perception works. When the mind stops forcing, it starts receiving. Silence, in this sense, is not empty. It's receptive. It's the state where you're no longer imposing your fears, preferences, and expectations onto reality. You're allowing reality to present itself as it is. And often, what it presents is the answer you were chasing so aggressively that you couldn't see it. This is why overthinking rarely produces clarity. It feels productive, but it's usually circular. The same thoughts, rearranged, the same assumptions, reinforced. When the mind is loud, it's often because it's trying to protect you from uncertainty, from making the wrong choice, from losing control. But that protection comes at a cost. It blocks perception. Quieting the mind doesn't mean suppressing thoughts or forcing calm. That only adds another layer of tension. Real quiet happens when attention shifts from internal narration to direct experience. The body breathing, the room you're in, the sensation of being present without commentary. In that state, something changes. The question you've been obsessing over loses its emotional charge, and without that charge, the answer doesn't feel dangerous anymore. Sometimes the answer that appears isn't what you wanted. It might suggest slowing down when you wanted acceleration, letting go when you wanted certainty, changing direction when you wanted reassurance. That's another reason the mind resists quiet, because silence tends to reveal truths that don't negotiate with your preferences. But notice this: when the answer appears in quiet, it often comes with relief. Even if it's challenging, there's a sense of alignment. The body relaxes, the internal friction eases. That's a signal in itself. Clarity doesn't always feel exciting, but it feels clean. People often say they're waiting for a sign, while simultaneously filling every moment with stimulation. Noise, content, opinions, constant input. There's no space for anything new to emerge. It's like asking a question and immediately talking over the response. Silence is the pause that allows the reply to be heard, and reality seems to respect this pause When you stop chasing, it meets you halfway, not because you stopped caring, but because you stopped interfering. You allowed the natural intelligence of the situation to organize itself. What was tangled begins to separate. What was confusing simplifies. This is also why answers tend to arrive after moments of surrender, not dramatic surrender, but subtle acceptance. I don't know right now. I can't force this. In that admission, the mind steps back, and something else steps forward. The quiet mind doesn't invent answers. It recognizes them. It notices patterns that were always there but obscured by fear or impatience. It senses when something fits and when it doesn't. And once you experience this a few times, you begin to trust the silence more than the noise, because you realize that the guidance you're looking for doesn't come from effort alone. It comes from alignment, and alignment requires listening, not chasing, stillness, not force. As this becomes clearer, another realization begins to form, that even when you weren't aware of it, something has been guiding your steps all along, nudging you through choices and encounters you didn't fully understand at the time. If you look back at your life honestly, there are moments that don't fully make sense when viewed only through logic. Decisions you made without a clear plan. Turns you took that weren't calculated. Encounters that seemed insignificant at the time but later changed everything. You didn't know why you chose them. You just did. And yet, somehow, they protected you, redirected you, or placed you exactly where you needed to be next. Most people call this luck in hindsight, or intuition, or coincidence. But what's interesting is how often these moments appear when your usual strategies aren't working, when you're tired of thinking, when options feel equally uncertain. When control loosens just enough for something else to influence your movement, that something else doesn't announce itself. It blends into your normal experience so well that you don't even recognize it as guidance. Guidance is rarely a clear instruction. It's more often a pull, a subtle preference, a feeling of ease toward one option and resistance toward another, even when logic argues otherwise. And because it doesn't come with proof, the mind tends to dismiss it. You tell yourself you're being irrational, that you should think it through more, that you need more information. But later, when you see how things unfolded, you realize that quiet pull was pointing somewhere real. What's important to understand is that guidance doesn't remove uncertainty. It operates within it. If everything were clear and guaranteed, there would be nothing to guide. You would simply follow instructions. Guidance shows up precisely because you don't have the full picture. It works through partial information, through feeling rather than certainty. Think about the times you avoided something without a strong reason. A job you didn't take, a conversation you postponed, a path that looked promising but felt wrong in your body. At the time, it might have seemed like hesitation or fear, but later you saw what that path would have required from you, what it would have cost, and you realize you were spared quietly, without explanation. This kind of guidance doesn't override your will. It doesn't force outcomes. It influences probability. It nudges you towards certain experiences and away from others. You still make the choice. You still carry the consequences, but the field of options shifts based on how aligned you are with yourself. The challenge is that guidance often feels ordinary. It doesn't feel sacred. It feels like a casual thought, a mild preference, an unremarkable decision. That's why people miss it. They expect guidance to feel extraordinary, powerful, unmistakable. But if it were unmistakable, it would remove responsibility. You wouldn't have to listen carefully. You wouldn't have to trust yourself. There's also a timing to it. Guidance tends to appear after effort, not before it. You try, you engage, you do what you can. And then when effort reaches its limit, something shifts. A door opens unexpectedly. A person appears. An obstacle dissolves without force. From the outside, it looks like chance. From the inside, it feels like relief. Even mistakes are part of this process. Not every guided step feels good. Some lead you into difficulty, not to punish you, but to refine your perception. You learn what doesn't fit by living it. You learn your boundaries by crossing them. Guidance isn't about avoiding pain entirely. It's about moving through experiences that shape you with minimal unnecessary damage. This is why guidance becomes clearer in retrospect. You see the thread only after it's woven. While you're inside the moment, all you have is a sense, faint, incomplete, easily doubted. Trust grows slowly, through repetition, through noticing how often those small, quiet inclinations led somewhere meaningful. As you become more aware of this, you start to recognize a pattern. When you're disconnected from yourself, guidance feels distant. When you're more present, it's closer. Not louder, just easier to notice. It doesn't compete with fear or urgency. It waits for them to pass. And yet, there are moments when guidance seems to intensify. When life feels like it's narrowing your options. When pressure increases. When the same challenge presents itself again, but with higher stakes. It's as if reality is asking a question more insistently, waiting to see whether you'll respond differently this time. It's not announced. There's no warning that says, "This is the moment." It arrives disguised as exhaustion, repetition, or quiet despair. You feel like you've done everything you know how to do, and nothing seems to change. The same pattern shows up again, slightly heavier than before. The same decision stands in front of you, but now avoiding it costs more than facing it. This is the point most people mistake for bad luck, when in fact it's a threshold. Reality has a way of applying pressure gradually. At first it's subtle, a mild discomfort you can ignore, then it becomes inconvenient, then emotionally draining. Each stage asks the same question in a different tone. Are you paying attention yet? The test isn't about endurance, it's about awareness. How long will you repeat what no longer works before you respond differently? At this critical point, old strategies fail. What used to distract you stops working. What used to motivate you feels hollow. You might notice that advice you once trusted no longer applies. This can feel disorienting, even unfair, but the loss of familiar tools isn't random. It creates a gap. And in that gap, something else has a chance to emerge. People often describe this moment as being at the edge. Not necessarily a dramatic collapse, but an internal one. The sense that continuing as you are will cost too much. The energy required to maintain the status quo becomes greater than the fear of change. That's when reality leans in. Not to push you, but to see what you choose when avoidance is no longer comfortable. What makes this a test is not the difficulty of the situation, but the clarity of the signal. By the time you reach this point, the message has been repeated in multiple forms, through relationships, through health, through work, through a persistent feeling that something is off. You can no longer claim you didn't know. The test is whether you'll listen now, or whether you'll demand that reality accommodate your resistance. At this stage, many people look for rescue, a sign big enough to remove doubt, a guarantee that the next step will be safe. But that's not how the test works. Reality rarely offers certainty at thresholds. It offers honesty. It shows you the cost of staying the same and leaves the choice in your hands. This is also where self-deception becomes tempting. You tell yourself the situation will resolve on its own, that timing just isn't right, that you'll act later when things calm down. But the pressure doesn't ease, it intensifies, not to punish you, but to narrow the gap between what you know and what you do. The test often revolves around a simple but uncomfortable action, a conversation you've avoided, a boundary you haven't set, a truth you haven't admitted to yourself. It's rarely complex. Complexity is usually an escape. The real question is usually clear, and that clarity is precisely what makes it difficult. What's important to notice is how your body reacts at this point. There's often a simultaneous sense of fear and relief. Fear of the unknown, relief at the possibility of no longer carrying what you've been carrying. That combination is a signal. It tells you you're close to something real. Reality uses sensation as much as circumstance to communicate. If you cross this threshold consciously, the external situation may not change immediately, but something internal does. You feel more aligned, even if things are still uncertain. If you don't cross it, reality doesn't disappear. It recalibrates. The test returns later, usually with higher stakes and less flexibility. This is why people say life keeps teaching the same lesson until it's learned. It's not moral judgment, it's efficiency. Reality uses repetition because repetition works. Each cycle strips away another layer of excuse, another distraction, another story you told yourself to avoid discomfort. At the critical point, the question isn't whether you're strong enough, it's whether you're willing to listen without demanding control, whether you can respond without forcing an outcome. And this is where many people realize something uncomfortable. They've been asking reality for help, but in a way that guarantees they won't hear the answer. Most people believe they're asking for help when, in reality, they're demanding relief. There's a subtle but important difference. Asking for help implies openness, a willingness to receive something unexpected, even uncomfortable. Demanding relief is about wanting the discomfort to stop without having to change orientation. And reality responds very differently to each. When you're overwhelmed, the mind tends to ask loud questions. Why is this happening to me? How do I make this go away? What sign will tell me I'm safe? These questions aren't neutral. They're loaded with urgency, fear, and a need for certainty. And that emotional charge distorts perception. You're not listening anymore. You're scanning for confirmation that things will return to how they were. This is why guidance often feels absent when you're desperate for it. Not because help isn't available, but because the way you're asking leaves no space for the response. Anxiety fills every gap. Urgency crowds out nuance. Comparison amplifies doubt. You're asking reality to speak, while simultaneously telling it exactly what it's allowed to say. There's also a tendency to ask for help in abstract terms. You want clarity, purpose, direction, but you don't anchor those requests in your actual behavior. You ask for answers while continuing the same patterns that created the confusion. Reality responds to movement, not to words. It listens to what you do repeatedly, not to what you hope will change. Sometimes help arrives in forms that feel like obstacles, a delay, a rejection, a plan falling apart. And because it doesn't match your expectation of assistance, you label it as interference. But from another angle, it might be protection, or redirection. Or a forced pause because you weren't willing to stop on your own. The wrong way of asking for help is also tied to timing. You ask only when things become unbearable, when the pressure peaks, when exhaustion sets in. At that point, your capacity to interpret subtle responses is at its lowest. You're reactive. Everything feels personal. Every inconvenience feels like an attack. In that state, even genuine guidance can feel threatening. There's a quieter way of asking that doesn't involve words at all. It's expressed through attention, through willingness to notice what keeps repeating, through honesty about what isn't working. When you stop arguing with the situation and start observing it, the quality of the response changes. Reality doesn't need you to beg. It needs you to participate. Another mistake is outsourcing the question entirely. You look for answers in other people's opinions, in endless content, in external validation. You gather advice but avoid decision. You hope someone else will see what you can't. And while perspective can be useful, over-reliance on it disconnects you from your own signal. You end up more informed but less clear. Help rarely comes in the form of reassurance. It comes as insight, and insight often disrupts your current narrative. It shows you where you're avoiding responsibility, where you're clinging to identity, where you're confusing familiarity with safety. That's why it's uncomfortable, and that's why the mind resists it. When you ask for help the wrong way, you're usually asking to be rescued from discomfort. When you ask the right way, you're asking to see clearly. One seeks escape, the other seeks understanding. And reality responds more readily to the second, because understanding leads to alignment, and alignment reduces unnecessary suffering. This shift doesn't require you to become calm or enlightened. It requires you to slow down just enough to notice how you're approaching the question. Are you trying to control the answer? Are you already rejecting possibilities that don't match your preference? Are you willing to act on what you see, even if it challenges your current path? As this becomes apparent, another distinction begins to surface. Not everything that feels like guidance actually is. Some signals are noise, some impulses are avoidance, and without an inner criterion, it's easy to mistake distraction for direction, especially when you're tired of uncertainty. When you're tired of uncertainty, anything that promises movement can feel like an answer. Action feels better than waiting. Change feels better than stillness. And this is where one of the most subtle mistakes happens. You don't follow what's true, you follow what relieves tension. Distraction steps in wearing the mask of direction. Distraction feels active. It creates the sensation of progress without requiring alignment. A new plan, a new goal, a new relationship. A new idea that pulls your attention away from the discomfort you don't want to face. And because it reduces anxiety temporarily, the mind interprets it as a sign. This must be it, you tell yourself. This feels better. But relief is not the same as clarity. Distraction calms the nervous system in the short term by shifting focus, not by resolving anything. Direction, on the other hand, often increases discomfort before it brings ease. It asks you to confront something real. It narrows your options instead of multiplying them. That's why it's less attractive when you're already overwhelmed. One way to notice the difference is through energy. Distraction creates a spike, excitement, urgency, a rush of motivation. Direction creates steadiness. It doesn't need to be exciting to be right. In fact, it's often quiet, almost boring. It feels like work rather than escape. And because it doesn't feed the craving for novelty, it's easy to overlook. This confusion is amplified in moments of crisis. When pressure is high, the mind searches for exits. Anything that offers distance from pain starts to look meaningful. You tell yourself you're following a sign, when in reality, you're following avoidance. And avoidance is persuasive. It speaks in confident tones. It promises immediate relief. Another reason this mistake is so common is that distraction often comes with external validation. Other people support it. It looks reasonable. It's socially acceptable. Direction, by contrast, can feel lonely. It may require you to say no when others expect yes, to slow down when everyone else is accelerating, to stay with a problem rather than escaping it. Direction tends to simplify your life. Distraction complicates it. One demands presence, the other consumes attention. If you notice that a supposed sign pulls you further away from yourself, into comparison, urgency, or constant stimulation, that's a clue. Direction brings you closer to your center, even if it challenges you. There's also a physical component. The body often knows before the mind admits it. Distraction feels like agitation underneath excitement, a restlessness that needs constant feeding. Direction may feel heavy at first, but there's a groundedness to it, a sense of rightness that doesn't require reinforcement. The mind prefers distraction because it preserves identity. You don't have to change who you are. You just change scenery. Direction, however, threatens the story you've been telling about yourself. It asks you to grow, to let go of roles, to release attachments that once felt necessary. That's why it's resisted. This doesn't mean that every new opportunity is a distraction. The difference lies in why you're drawn to it. Are you moving towards something or away from something? Are you responding to clarity or reacting to discomfort? These questions are uncomfortable because they remove plausible deniability. They force honesty. When distraction masquerades as direction, reality tends to respond with friction. Things don't flow. The initial excitement fades quickly. Obstacles multiply, not because you chose wrongly in a moral sense, but because you chose prematurely. You answered the wrong question. Instead of asking, "What is being asked of me here?" you asked, "How do I stop feeling this?" Over time, this pattern creates exhaustion. You move a lot, but arrive nowhere. You collect experiences, but avoid transformation. And eventually, even distraction loses its power to soothe. That's when another layer of understanding begins to surface, that the chaos you're experiencing isn't random, but a form of communication. A request, disguised as disruption, asking you to look more closely at what's actually being asked of you. When chaos enters your life, the first instinct is to restore order as quickly as possible. fix what's broken, return things to how they were, make the feeling stop. Crisis feels like a malfunction, an interruption to the plan you thought you were following. But if you look closely, most crises don't arrive to destroy something that was working. They arrive to expose something that wasn't. A crisis compresses time. It removes options. It forces your attention onto what you've been avoiding. The routines that once kept you comfortable suddenly collapse. The explanations that once made sense lose their power. And in that disorientation, a deeper question emerges. Not about how to fix the situation, but about why it became necessary in the first place. Chaos feels random only when viewed from the surface. Beneath it, there's often a clear pattern. The same compromise is repeated too long. The same misalignment tolerated out of fear or convenience. The same truth postponed because it was inconvenient. Crisis is what happens when these accumulations reach a tipping point. Reality stops negotiating quietly and starts speaking in volume. This is why crises are rarely subtle. They break through denial. They interrupt momentum. They demand presence. You can no longer distract yourself effectively. The usual escapes lose their appeal. And while this feels cruel in the moment, it serves a purpose. Chaos narrows your focus to what actually matters. What makes a crisis so painful is not just the external disruption, but the internal resistance to change. You're being asked to let go of something, an identity, a plan, a relationship, a belief about who you are or how life should unfold, and the mind fights this fiercely. It interprets change as loss, even when what's being lost is no longer aligned. In this sense, crisis is not an enemy. It's a message delivered with urgency. The problem is that most people try to solve the chaos without hearing the request. They focus on restoring stability, not on understanding what the instability is pointing toward. As soon as things calm down, they return to the same patterns, setting the stage for the next disruption. A crisis doesn't ask for perfection. It asks for honesty. It asks you to stop pretending that something is sustainable when it isn't. It invites you to question assumptions you've outgrown. But this invitation doesn't come politely. It comes with pressure, because pressure is what breaks inertia. There's also a strange clarity that can appear in the middle of chaos. Moments when you know, with surprising certainty, what no longer fits, what you can't go back to. Even if you don't yet know what comes next, there's a sense of irreversibility. That's not confusion, that's transition. Reality is asking you to step out of an old structure before a new one is visible. The danger is interpreting crisis as personal failure. You blame yourself. You search for what you did wrong. While responsibility matters, self-blame obscures the signal. Crisis is less about punishment and more about recalibration. It's feedback, not condemnation. If you listen carefully, chaos often highlights a single question beneath all the noise. Where have you been out of alignment with yourself? Where have you been enduring instead of choosing? Where have you been waiting for permission instead of acting? These questions don't demand immediate answers. They demand attention. When you respond to a crisis only by trying to eliminate discomfort, you miss the deeper shift it's asking for. But when you allow yourself to sit with the uncertainty, not passively, but attentively, the chaos begins to organize. Not externally at first, but internally. You start to see what needs to change, even if the path forward is still unclear. And this is where many people get stuck. They recognize that something must change, but they expect the answer to arrive in a familiar form, a clear solution, a dramatic breakthrough. Instead, what often appears is something modest, even disappointing, a small idea, a subtle loss, a quiet realization that doesn't look like rescue. Because the answer you're looking for is rarely far away. It's usually already present, just not in the shape you imagined. When people imagine an answer, they usually imagine clarity arriving fully formed, a moment of certainty, a clear instruction that removes doubt and makes the next step obvious. But reality rarely works that way. The answers it provides are often incomplete, subtle, and easy to dismiss. Not because they're insufficient, but because they don't match the image you've been holding in your mind. You're looking for resolution, and what shows up is loss. You're looking for reassurance, and what appears is an uncomfortable idea. You're looking for confirmation, and what you receive is a quiet disruption. And because it doesn't feel helpful, you overlook it. You tell yourself it can't be the answer. It's too small, too inconvenient, too ordinary. But answers don't always arrive to comfort you. They arrive to realign you. And realignment often begins with subtraction, not addition. Something leaves your life. A role ends. A door closes without explanation. At first, this feels like failure or rejection. Only later do you realize it created the space that was missing. Sometimes the answer is a conversation you didn't plan to have, a comment that stays with you longer than expected, a moment of honesty that stings but rings true. It doesn't come as advice, it comes as resonance. You feel it in your body before you understand it with your mind, and because it doesn't come wrapped in certainty, you hesitate to trust it. There's also a tendency to overlook answers that require patience. You want movement and the answer is rest. You want expansion and the answer is consolidation. You want to escape and the answer is to stay and face something you've been avoiding. These don't feel like solutions. They feel like delays. But often they're the only way forward. Another reason answers go unnoticed is because they challenge your identity. They suggest you've been asking the wrong question, that what you thought you wanted isn't what you actually need, that the direction you've been pursuing no longer fits who you are becoming, and that realization can feel destabilizing. Reality doesn't argue with your expectations, it simply presents alternatives. It places information in your environment and waits to see what you notice. A repeated theme in books you're drawn to, a pattern in the people you encounter, a consistent reaction your body has to certain situations. These are not random. They're contextual answers, but they require interpretation, not consumption. The mind often dismisses these signals because they don't provide immediate certainty. They require you to participate, to test something, to take a small uncomfortable step without a guarantee. And that feels risky. It feels easier to keep searching for a more definitive sign than to act on something subtle. There's also grief involved in recognizing the answer that's already there, because it means accepting that the solution isn't dramatic. It won't rescue you. It won't make sense of everything all at once. It will simply move you one step closer to alignment. And that can feel underwhelming when you're exhausted. But pay attention to what persists, not what excites you briefly, but what returns. The idea that won't leave you alone, the feeling that keeps resurfacing, the option that remains when distractions fade. Answers tend to be patient. They don't chase you, they wait. When you start to acknowledge these quiet presences, something shifts. You stop demanding that the answer look a certain way. You become more curious, more observant, less focused on resolution, and more attentive to coherence. And in that shift, the environment begins to feel more responsive, because once you see that the answer is already around you, another pattern becomes impossible to ignore. When you continue to overlook it, reality doesn't withdraw. It intensifies. The message becomes harder to ignore. The volume increases, not out of cruelty but necessity. At first, reality is polite. It offers hints you can easily dismiss, a feeling you explain away, a situation you postpone dealing with, a pattern you notice but don't act on. Nothing dramatic happens yet, so you assume there's time, and there usually is, at the beginning. Reality doesn't rush, it repeats. When those early signals are ignored, the tone changes. What was once a quiet discomfort becomes irritation. What felt optional starts to feel heavy. The same issue shows up in different forms, through different people, in different contexts. You tell yourself it's just stress, bad timing, coincidence. But repetition is never accidental. It's a message that didn't land the first time. This escalation isn't punishment, it's amplification. Reality increases volume when subtlety fails, not because it wants to overwhelm you, but because it needs your attention. And attention is often only given when something becomes uncomfortable enough to interrupt routine. You might notice this in your body before you notice it in your circumstances. Tension that doesn't release. Fatigue that sleep doesn't fix. a low-level anxiety that lingers even when things appear fine on the surface. The body is often the first place reality raises its voice. It communicates through sensation when thought refuses to listen. If that still doesn't register, the external world responds. Relationships strain, opportunities collapse, plans unravel unexpectedly. These moments feel unfair because they disrupt the narrative you are maintaining. But from another perspective, they're consistent. They align with what you've been avoiding acknowledging. People often describe this phase as everything falling apart at once. But it's rarely everything. It's specific. The areas most out of alignment are the ones that break down first. The structures built on endurance instead of choice. The commitments sustained by obligation instead of truth. What makes this stage so difficult is the temptation to double down, to push harder, to control more, to force outcomes in the name of stability. But force rarely restores alignment. It usually increases resistance. The louder reality speaks, the more obvious it becomes that the old way of responding no longer works. There's also a psychological resistance here. Accepting that reality is responding to you implies responsibility, not blame, but participation. It means admitting that ignoring subtle signals had consequences, and that can be uncomfortable. It's easier to frame the situation as bad luck or external failure than as feedback. But once you see the pattern, it's hard to unsee. The escalation follows a logic. First discomfort, then frustration, then collapse. Each stage offered a chance to respond differently. Each was a request for adjustment, not a demand for suffering. The collapse phase often feels like a loss of control, but in many cases, it's the removal of an illusion of control. The structures that fall were already unstable. Reality simply stopped supporting them. And without that support, what remains is what's real. This is also where people misinterpret intensity as cruelty. They ask why things had to get so bad. But intensity is often the only language that breaks through denial. When subtlety fails, clarity must be unmistakable. Even here, reality isn't closing doors arbitrarily. It's narrowing focus, stripping away options that kept you circling the same question. It's forcing you into contact with what matters, because every other distraction has lost its power. If you listen at this stage, something surprising can happen. Beneath the chaos, there's a sense of inevitability, not despair, but recognition. A quiet knowing that this reckoning was overdue, that despite the pain, something honest is finally happening. And as the noise peaks, another realization begins to form. That what you've been calling coincidence, synchronicity, or bad timing might actually be urgency. Not random events, but a final attempt to realign you with what you already know, before the cost of ignoring it becomes even greater. When several things happen at once, the mind looks for randomness. It's easier to believe that events are unrelated than to consider that they might be converging. A message you didn't expect, a meeting that feels strangely timed. Information that appears from different directions, all pointing to the same underlying tension. You call it coincidence because the alternative feels unsettling, that reality might be accelerating its response. Urgency doesn't arrive dramatically at first. It gathers quietly. Signals cluster, themes repeat. What once appeared occasionally now shows up everywhere. The same question echoes through different situations. The same choice presents itself in new forms. And because each event can be explained on its own, it's tempting to dismiss the pattern entirely. But urgency is not about individual events. It's about timing. It appears when delay is no longer neutral, when waiting carries a cost, when indecision becomes a form of action, and that action leads further away from alignment. Reality doesn't force urgency prematurely. It introduces it when the window for gentle correction has narrowed. This is why urgent moments often feel compressed. Decisions seem to stack up. Emotional responses intensify. Time feels distorted. You may notice that you're less able to tolerate what you once endured. Your threshold lowers. That's not weakness. It's information. It's a signal that something essential can no longer be postponed. What makes urgency uncomfortable is that it removes the luxury of interpretation. You can no longer endlessly analyze what something might mean. You feel called to respond, even if you don't fully understand the implications. And the mind resists this because it prefers certainty before action. But urgency flips that order. It demands movement first, clarity later. People often miss urgency because they expect it to feel inspiring. Instead, it feels pressurized. It can show up as restlessness, impatience, or a sense that something is off, even when nothing obvious is wrong. The nervous system picks up on the shift before the mind can explain it. You might notice that distractions lose their appeal during these periods. What once provided relief now feels hollow. Avoidance takes more effort than engagement. This is another sign of urgency. Reality is closing escape routes, not to trap you, but to bring your attention back to what matters. Coincidences also tend to carry emotional charge when urgency is present. They don't just happen, they land. A sentence you overhear stays with you. A seemingly random event affects you more than it should. You feel seen, exposed, or unsettled. That reaction isn't accidental. It's part of the signal. Urgency doesn't mean catastrophe is coming. It means a decision is ripening. It means the conditions for change are aligned, and delaying will only add friction. But urgency doesn't dictate what the change should be. It simply insists that neutrality is no longer an option. This is where many people freeze. They wait for the urgency to pass, hoping things will return to normal. But urgency doesn't dissolve through waiting. It either resolves through response or escalates through resistance. And resistance often disguises itself as patience, caution, or the need for more information. There's also a deeper layer to urgency. It often appears when you're closer to your truth than you realize, when alignment is within reach. When a small shift could relieve a large amount of internal tension. Reality accelerates at these moments because the potential for coherence is high. If you pause long enough to feel into these coincidences, a pattern becomes clearer. They're not pushing you towards something new as much as they're pulling you away from what's no longer viable. They're not asking you to become someone else, but to stop betraying what you already know. And this is where the final understanding begins to take shape. That what reality sends you in moments like this is rarely what you want. It doesn't arrive as comfort or confirmation. It arrives as necessity, as an invitation that may feel inconvenient, even unwelcome, but carries the potential to change everything if you respond to it honestly. What reality sends you is rarely what you asked for. It doesn't arrive shaped like comfort, certainty, or immediate relief. It arrives shaped like necessity, like an interruption that forces honesty, like a moment that strips away noise so something essential can finally be seen. Reality doesn't negotiate with preferences, it responds to alignment. And every time you meet what's sent with attention instead of resistance, something inside you reorganizes. True awakening doesn't happen when you collect more signs, more confirmations, more explanations. It happens when you stop demanding that reality speak louder and begin to understand what the silence has been pointing to all along. The quiet moments, the repeated patterns, the inner responses you can no longer ignore. That's where the real conversation has always been taking place. If you stayed until here, write this phrase in the comments. I'm listening now. That way I know you reached the end. And if this resonated with you, watch one of the videos appearing on your screen now. If you want more content like this, that's where the conversation continues.